Welcome to Episode 5 of O'Neill & Associates Federal Insight, a podcast production of OA On Air. Today we are joined by John Cahill, Jenn Krowchun, and Ben Craig for a discussion of the fiscal year 2022 Appropriations earmark process, as well as a look ahead for what that process will look like this year. Be sure to listen until the end to hear our team's predictions on what you'll hear from President Biden at tonight's State of the Union. Enjoy.
Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
How's everybody doing?
Good.
Doing pretty well.
Good.
It's March 1st. We are coming at you part of the third month of the year, the day of State of the Union. It's the first time that the president will be addressing Congress under a State of the Union. Previously, it was just a joint address to Congress. We're all eagerly anticipating that conversation, but we really wanted to talk, get a little bit ahead of ourselves and talk about appropriations. Certainly, we are anticipating, we know that committee staff and members of the appropriation committees in both the House and the Senate have been working to really kind of finalize the agreement for the omnibus and hope to have that finalized by the deadline when the current CR runs out, the continuing resolution, March 11th. So that at that point, we'll be able to wrap up FY 2022 appropriations. We understand that as is right now, all of the congressionally directed spending that had been included by both the House and the Senate is so far still intact, and we're hopeful and believe that will still be the case. And that being said, I know that there's many folks are eager to find out when the next round for FY 2023 will begin. I know, Ben, you've been kind of monitoring this a little bit. If you want to just kind of give us a quick little synopsis, that would be great.
Absolutely. You know, funny enough, just as we're witnessing the end of last year's process, we're starting to see some of the first beginnings of the FY23 process. I believe so far in Massachusetts, we've seen Congressman Moulton's appropriations request page go up onto his website, as well as Congresswoman Clark. The others are still waiting. That deadline is still a little unclear on the House side. I know Congressman Moulton has a tentative slot for March 30th posted on his website for all requests to be made by that point. But, you know, judging off of last year's process, we might see that move a little bit further into April. I think some of the deadlines for the subcommittees last year were right around April 15th, April 16th. So I think there might be a little bit of wiggle room, if you would. And I know from Congresswoman Clark's page, there still isn't a deadline there.
And I think
So Ben, will there be changes from last year? And that, you know, if we all recall that the House had a very complicated system, and I mean, folks did okay, but it was very complicated. Do you think that, and even deferring the due date, that there'll be changes that'll smooth this out a little bit and make it a little simpler?
I mean, I know that's certainly been part of the conversation that we've held with the offices, talking to staff. They expected to see some changes coming up in this round, you know, learning some lessons from the FY22 process. What we still haven't seen, though, is, you know, from the main committee pages last year, they put out a full listing where you could find your representative to put forth a request. And they also had instructions for each one of the subcommittee bills that kind of explained a little bit more about which accounts you could post to. And that's where we expect to see those changes, I believe. That still has not been released by the House side or the Senate side. So we're still looking for those documents to perform an assessment of what kind of changes we're expecting for this next fiscal year.
I have to imagine, though, Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro probably wants to wait maybe until the FY 2022 is wrapped up. But I too am anticipating hopefully that kind of dear colleague letter talking about the process, their deadlines, and then back up to when the members need to have finalized and collected their selections to then, you know, pick their list. And I think a huge, John, to your point, there was a lot of changing of the deadlines last year. I think a huge detriment, though, is the fact that they were still majority remote at that point. And so at least now staff are in the building, they're meeting, and that maybe they've been able to, you know, because we have been operating under a couple of CRs, try to work out these kinks beforehand. Is my guess. I'm curious to see if, a little bit to your point, if some of these, the subcommittees are the subcommittees, but if some of the various funding programs and titles have been opened up or expanded kind of under lessons learned the last go around. I think that there was a couple of projects or opportunities that we were assisting with that just didn't necessarily fit in some of these titles once we had further conversations with the subcommittee.
I think that was a factor in the House committee not achieving the $15 billion goal for the member-directed projects. If you recall, they've said, well, we're going to set aside 15 billion here. And after they put out the guidelines and everyone scrambled to see if they could fit their project in, they ended up spending 10 billion, which is quite a shock. Usually you spend it all. But I think that system was a factor in keeping the number down. I don't think that they want to go through that again this year.
No, I would. I wonder if now we're just going to, go right over that.
Right. It'll be 20 billion because you got to get the 5 billion back from last year that you didn't spend.
Right, and it is a midterm. You don't want to, be leaving money on the table, certainly, right? So, yeah, that will be interesting. And to that point too, I think that a lot of the member offices were cautioned by the subcommittee, and then certainly cautioned applicants. They're only going to be able to include their top 1, 2, maybe projects. That's why they had to rank them 1 through 10. I think we saw, and obviously we have a great blog post on our website that really kind of does a deep dive into each state, all the Senate projects that were included, and then all of the individual member director requests for each House members, 10, and the ones that were then funded. I think, some states had 8, 6, 5, 10, that were funded. It was really quite remarkable when you think about it, because that was such a strong message we were getting from Congress last spring.
Sure. Yes.
Just to throw in an example there, Jen, I know Connecticut, I believe there was one representative that didn't get all 10 of their requests, and it was Chairwoman Delora. I believe she had 8 of her projects funded.
Oh.
Wow. And the others had all of theirs funded?
I believe that's true. Yeah, I'd have to look back at the numbers, but it's in the blog post.
That's unusual. The chairperson doesn't get every project. Wow.
Yeah. I do think too, and not to get too specific, we did see a couple of themes of some members chose to maybe fund projects on their priority list that, were some of those things that are not as always as easy to fund or as, interesting, especially a lot of the road work that was required. That was one that we saw a couple members take on. Others, they really focused on services, community services. So be it health centers or shelters or connections to schools. That was something that was really prominent. So I think it'll be interesting to see, based on that, how they kind of change their themes or their priority focuses, given what was funded last year.
Yeah. Do you think that, if you go back 12 years to the days of earmarks, there were many schools of higher ed included. And I was struck, I don't think that the number even came close this past go around. Not to say that there were none, but there weren't too many. Do you think that'll change going forward here?
Sure. Ben, feel free to weigh in too. I wonder, last year, campuses of higher education, they were just trying to make it through the next day as far as managing the kind of the COVID response. And I think that maybe they were just overwhelmed. To be fair, it wasn't an easy application. I think, John, we joked earlier this week that you used to just call up Senator Kennedy and provide a paragraph and say, this is what we're looking for funding. And
yeah, it was a lot easier.
Now you have to be able to, find the appropriate subcommittee, the appropriate title to ensure that you meet all the requirements. There really is some kind of having to understand legislatively how this would fit into the appropriate accounts. I think that we did see that a lot of staff were as helpful as possible, and certainly they've had some additional briefings from subcommittees on how to advise them going forward. And there's definitely been some, best practices and lessons learned, but I think it's really hard to navigate. And then there's pretty extensive narratives that you have to include and details,
Right.
and really do want to see it be a shovel-ready project so that you can wrap it up and spend the funding within a year of being awarded this grant. So, how many campuses, are now, maybe they're looking now and saying there's some capital projects or some other kind of opportunities that they were not able to pursue given the restraints financially and capacity wise that they were under last spring. I'd love to think that there's some real opportunities there. I remember, we had talked to a couple of different organizations that had been interested, and they just did not have the capacity to kind of come up with this and think about it, or it was such an early start project that they had to think about it more, that hopefully they've had the last year, we're seeing what was funded. I don't know, Ben, if you have kind of a overall sense of what was funded as far as higher ed projects and some themes that you saw.
Saw less on the brick and mortar side of things, as John kind of initially assessed there, more so on research projects or transitions to more renewable energy sources. For example, I believe it was Congressman Auchincloss and Keating paired up for a project with Bristol Community College for an offshore wind institute. The senators from Rhode Island, Reid and Whitehouse, got together for some URI, I think it was their marine biology program, some research funding there. So I wonder to what extent these people already had the project descriptions, research projects that have been in the works. Whereas more bricks and mortar funding, repairs to buildings, that didn't receive as much attention in the requests or in things that got through into the Senate texts as well.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And Jen reminds us both, I think, with the shovel-ready terminology, the committee just did not look favorably on bricks and mortar, and extremely difficult. Maybe on the Senate side it was more favorable, but it'll be interesting to see in this next round whether they open it up to at least some bricks and mortar for improvements, or to restore an entity. So maybe not new construction, but something that would bring a facility into the 21st century, particularly as it relates to climate change and, as you say, resiliency.
I think that's a really important theme. And I do think what is nice is that we have seen and identified funding for bricks and mortar and infrastructure improvements and rehabilitation and resiliency under new programs that have now started to roll out under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that was passed in November. I think a lot of federal agencies now are referring to it as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, BIL. And so there has been opportunities for that. There is opportunities for a lot of funding that is going to the states for formula and for grants for, EV charging stations, for solar panels, for additional programs that have been plussed up, but also some additional ones at the federal level to be exploring this directly. So, I'm curious how those applicants maybe who applied last time maybe will be pivoting and looking at directly at these grant programs. And then at the same time, how many projects or opportunities that they have been trying to, members of Congress and others get into Build Back Better, which is just really dead at this point, will try to tailor that towards an appropriation.
Certainly, you mean along the climate change provisions or related to climate change? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, but I mean, all the last couple of weeks, even with BBB not really existing, many comments on we must do climate related provisions somehow here. So, and the tax extender certainly, and then of course appropriations. So I think they'll grab any tool possible within appropriations to forward that which they thought they were going to forward for climate change and BBB.
definitely.
Yeah,
So we'll be, certainly putting out more information as we get, deadlines and some directions from the House and Senate committees. I'd be remiss not to get your thoughts on the State of the Union tonight. I think, as you said earlier, the theme for everything going into this year and in this presidency certainly is climate change and addressing that and looking long term. I know that we're really expecting to see President Biden, lay out maybe not calling it Build Back Better, but taking elements from that bill that had that bipartisan support and packaging it to include those plus ups and new programs for climate change legislation, as well as finally addressing the tax extenders, which have expired and are
yeah.
just not solved at this point. But any other thoughts as far as what to watch for, or directives or direction that will kind of come out of this speech tonight?
Ben, you can grab the football there if you want. I have a
think-
couple of thoughts, but go ahead.
I think there will be a few people around the world watching to see the take on the Russian-Ukraine conflict. So a little bit outside of the scope of the appropriations conversation, but I'm certainly interested in looking forward to see how that's progressed and what the president will say about it tonight.
I'll be curious if he mentions and calls for a specific amount of money for Ukrainian emergency funding support and relief. I know that there's been some figures proposed, and there seems to be an overall sentiment on the Hill to be supportive of some supplemental emergency funding and support for Ukraine. Is that going to get tied to the omnibus package that includes the FY 2022 appropriations? We'll have to see. That would be a huge feat to pull off in 10 days, but certainly we could probably try to do that.
Yeah. I actually, I was going to say very much the same thing. I think question one is he going to bring that supplemental topic up, or just stick to the script on, what we're doing to be helpful to the Ukrainians? Two, either tonight or in the days ahead, they will have to address the issue of do a standalone Ukrainian supplemental bill, just that, restricted to that, highly focused, of course, or do you try to fold something into the omnibus bill? My guess would be the former, not the latter. So I think that I had said to you folks that based on conversations last week, it was pretty evident that the House, at least, and probably the Senate, wants to do this omnibus right now, if they could, immediately, and be done with it. Then you could move on to a supplemental and give it due consideration. I mean, the other part of that is that, the House Armed Services or Senate Armed Services are the authorizing committees for whatever we would be providing militarily, right? Yes, there is the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, but they're appropriations. So I got to believe that the House and Senate Armed Services Committee would want a role in what we're going to provide to the Ukrainians over the next X period. That's my opinion, but I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Well, they'll get their marching orders tonight for sure.
I think so. I'm pretty certain they will. In any case.
Well, thanks. This is really helpful. I think certainly a very busy March, and a number of things on the agenda, some of which we just briefly mentioned today, but many others that are going to be coming down the pipeline. So we'll have to revisit this conversation again.
Absolutely. Look forward to it.
Thanks,
Thank
Ben.
you.
John.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to episode 5 of O'Neill & Associates Federal Insight, a podcast production of OA On Air. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and follow our pages on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Also, be sure to leave a review below so that others like you can find our podcast. Thank you for listening.